what is a Viva, who goes to the Viva, what is the purpose of it, when does it take place, where does it take place, basically the who, what, when, where and why of a PhD Viva. Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. In today's video I'm going to be answering some of your questions about the PhD Viva, which you asked me on Instagram, and just sharing some general information such as what is a Viva or a Viva Voce, if that's even how you pronounce it. This is part of a series of videos that I'm creating about the Viva process now that I have finished my Viva and passed it and I'm officially a doctor of philosophy. Now that I have gone through that experience, I have several videos about the Viva that I want to share with you, so make sure that you are subscribed, you have your notification bell on so that you get access to all of these videos. And if you're interested in the other videos in this series, if it's months from now that you're watching this, make sure you check the description for where those videos are. Firstly, the PhD Viva, also known as the Viva Voce or oral defense, is a oral examination, meaning a spoken exam, that takes place after PhD students have submitted their thesis. This is basically the final assessment of your PhD, so that doctoral students can then defend their work in front of a panel of examiners. There are a number of things that the examiners will want to determine during this process, but essentially we want to make sure that the thesis is the candidate's own work and it's not the work of someone else or potentially just the supervisor's work, but that it is the student's work. And then to also make sure that the candidate's understanding of the subject area, their research and the thesis itself is well known. I have heard people say that they will also be determining the publishability of research that's demonstrated in the thesis. I know plenty of people who pass their Viva without any publications, but I've heard that having publications is definitely a way that can boost your chances of passing your Viva, because then you're essentially showing already that it is publishable in part or in whole. Every country, every university, every department might have a slightly different way of carrying out these Vivas, so it's important that you ensure you know what's involved in your own university and make sure that you read the guidelines for those, but I'll be speaking more generally about what typically is involved with a Viva. In the beginning, there's usually an introduction between the candidate, the examiners, the chairperson, whoever is present. And usually there might be an overview of the process to give the candidate a bit of a breathing room about the process. Most Vivas will begin with a presentation by the candidate, so you might be asked to do a short presentation about the main contributions of your research. The length of this can vary. I think typically it's between 10 and 20 minutes that these presentations will be. And then there's a period of questions and discussion. So this is the main part of the defense where the examiners are going to be going through the thesis, asking you questions about the content and the research process that was involved. There are lots of different types of questions that can be asked. The questions can be quite broad, so it can be about why this research was done and why you chose this. The questions can be clarifications, so more minor questions, and they can also be quite deep questions trying to, make sure that the student understands the depth of the research too. In some institutions, there will actually be a correction period before the Viva where you might be asked to make some corrections to your thesis. This is typically when a repeat Viva is being done, so you might have had some corrections since the last Viva. And then there may also be some time when the candidate gets to ask any questions to the examiners. Since these will be a panel of experts, it might be beneficial to find out their opinions on the research. Finally, there's a conclusion of the examination, and then the candidate will typically be leaving the room while the examiners discuss the outcome. During this time, they will be looking at how the candidate performed in the Viva and then the quality of the thesis and agreeing on the outcome of the Viva. The outcome then will be conveyed to the candidate, so they'll be asked to come in and usually they'll be given some feedback about the thesis also. Especially if there's going to be any corrections involved. As I said, this does vary very much institute to institute, so do make sure that you look into what your own specific university does for their Viva. When does the Viva take place? So the Viva typically takes place a couple of months post PhD submission. There are a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, the candidate needs time to prepare. It's important that post PhD there is a bit of a window where you get time away from your thesis and then you get to go back to your thesis and revisit it and then prepare for this final examination. It's also to allow the examiners time to prepare, since they will have to read quite probably a lengthy thesis and create detailed notes and come up with questions. So typically it very much depends between universities, but it can be 1 to 2 months or even a little bit longer than that after the PhD submission that the Viva takes place. How long is the Viva? It again varies very much institute to institute, but a typical Viva will be between 2 and 4 hours. Less than 2 hours would be considered a short Viva. Longer than 4 hours would be considered quite a long Viva. So I would typically expect it to be between 2 and 4 hours. In my own experience, it goes by very quickly. Even though it seems like a long time, it doesn't feel like it's that long because you're engaged in the discussion the whole time. Who is present at the Viva? Well, of course, there will be the candidate who is defending their research. There are the examiners, and typically there will be 2 examiners. One will be the internal examiner, who is a faculty member from the candidate's own university that's not directly involved in the research. So you can't have done really any research with them before. They'll be very familiar with the specific university's guidelines for theses. Then there's also an external examiner from another institute who's been chosen for their expertise in the subject area of the thesis. This person then will be quite an unbiased assessment of the quality and originality of the work. I think the issue, if they were from the same university, there might be, people wanting to ensure that there is more and more students graduating, and the external examiner ensures that it is an unbiased opinion, especially because they will usually not have met the candidate before. Sometimes there will be a chairperson of the Viva, which was the case in mine. I think it's kind of common in Europe. This will be someone who oversees the process and makes sure that it's conducted in a fair way, ensuring the university's regulations. Sometimes the internal examiner kind of fills that gap in the sense that they have the sense of the current university's guidelines, but the chair is someone who doesn't actually get involved in the questioning process. So they are literally just there to organise and make sure that everyone's in the right place, and when it comes time for the candidate to leave, they're the person ensuring that happens, kind of thing. The supervisors involved with the thesis are sometimes allowed to attend. It's down to the candidate themselves and the examiners, but they're not allowed to participate in the discussion unless specifically asked to do so. And it's not a great sign if that happens, because it should be the student who is answering these questions. Sometimes there will be an independent observer who is involved in the process. So this is usually if the internal examiner, it's their first time examining, that they will just be making sure that it's carried out correctly. Again, if there's a chair, that person might fill that role. So that is pretty much it. I think obviously the most important people involved, aside from the student, will be the examiners. So I'll talk briefly about where to find these examiners. Where do these come from? It's often the case that the supervisor of the thesis will nominate some examiners based on their expertise of the subject area and the thesis. These do have to be impartial, so there can't be any conflict of interest, meaning any work that's been done together. They are usually brought to the student, and the student also gets a say in this, I believe. They have to then get approved by the department before the oral exam can take place. So they'll be reviewed to make sure that they are a suitable match. This will be based on their expertise in the field, their reputation in the academic community, their previous experience in examining PhD students or PhD theses, and how well they can be impartial. So are they impartial? Yeah. So typically it'll be the supervisor's awareness of different examiners that could be relevant for the thesis, and that was the case in mine. I think if not, it would have been most likely choosing someone from the specific conference that we are involved with for a lot of our work, because they would have been really knowledgeable about the specific technique that we use in the thesis. So if not the person that they had in mind, I think we would have gone down the route of finding someone connected to the conference that we tend to attend. There are various types of questions that can be asked during the Viva, but some typical themes that we see in terms of the questions being asked will be thesis specific questions. So these will be talking about the content of the thesis, like can we summarize the main points? And I definitely had some questions like that with regards to summarizing different experiments that I'd done. Knowledge-based questions, which will be trying to test the candidate's knowledge or understanding of their field. So thinking about the related work and how this work builds on that, or what the current state of the art is. The candidate will also be asked to critically evaluate their own research. So can we address or can we identify the strengths and limitations of the research that's been done? There are a lot of hypothetical questions that get asked, like, if this wasn't a problem, what would you have done? If this hadn't happened, like if COVID hadn't happened, how would that have affected your work? If you had any kind of data set, what would that look like? So allowing the candidate to kind of think on their feet. There's a lot of questions about the future. So where does this research lead to? What's the future work? And again, that will be kind of covered in the conclusion chapter, most likely, of the thesis. You might be asked quite detail-oriented questions about specific choices that were made in different points of analysis. And then depending on the type of research being done, there might be more ethical questions being asked. So if you had any ethical approval, that might be something that's brought up. There's no real set of questions that should be asked or would need to be asked, but these are the types of questions that you can expect. And I think something to be aware of is there might be some really general questions in there, like, why did you choose this topic? And not to get thrown by those questions and then suddenly getting into the very specific questions that come up. Oftentimes in the question period, there might be some kind of starter off questions, and then it will be time to go through the thesis chapter by chapter and have a discussion at each point. So in the introduction chapter, it's kind of about the grounding of this work, like where it came from and why it was done and things like that. The questions about the literature review can be testing the candidate's knowledge of that literature and, how they feel this work contributes to that literature. Depending on the structure of your thesis, so I had a data set chapter, so we had a lot of discussions about the type of work I did on that data and the choices that were made. So they were very detail-oriented questions that were about, why I chose specific features and not other ones. And again, linking back to the literature a lot of the time. Then I had different experiment chapters, so I had questions that were more so summarizing those chapters, and less about, really the choice of methodology. I feel it wasn't questioned as much because I think, again, it was questioned once or twice and I feel like I kind of answered it, and I had something that was grounding me in why these choices were made, that were kind of difficult to dispute. It really just came down to explainability of the work that we were doing. And then kind of around the conclusion chapter then, it will be all about the future work, the generalizability of the research, and then again, strengths and limitations in general, which can kind of come up at any point. So those are the kinds of questions you might want to be prepared for. The outcome of the Viva. So there are different potential outcomes of the Viva. It definitely depends on the university, but the typical ones that we will see will be firstly passing with corrections. That's the holy grail of PhD Vivas. It's quite rare. I've known a couple of students to have this, which is rare that I've even known that many students, like 2 students to have done that. But this means that the thesis is accepted as is with no changes. And it's pretty rare because most theses will require at least some corrections. Pass with minor corrections is the next kind of level. And that's the one that I received. So you have, some pretty minor revisions to make, usually within a couple of months. And then these get reviewed by the internal examiner who signs off on the final thesis. But at this point you have passed, you are still a doctor. So even though I have to do some corrections for my thesis, I have passed, which is great. Then we have pass with major corrections. So this is where there are some significant changes to be made, which might mean adding in whole new sections. And the time frame for these is usually longer, so it could be 6 months to a year. And then you'll be resubmitting. But at this point, again, you still have passed. There can be a period where it's not quite a pass and it's not quite a fail. So this is the revise and resubmit option, where the thesis has potential to be a doctoral thesis, but there is still a lot of additional work that needs to be done. So you're essentially you'll basically be asked to resubmit this thesis, and you'll have to do potentially another Viva, depending on how much revision is required. When there are options for fail, one will be being awarded a lower degree, so it's not of the level of a PhD, but you might be offered a master's in philosophy, which I think is a real kick into the teeth. I would much rather the revise and resubmit. I think it's pretty rare for this to happen, because most universities will have kind of a transfer at some point to ensure that the thesis is going to be viable as a PhD thesis, which avoids the failing kind of process. So if you lay out the plan and you follow the plan, it should be a PhD thesis, and it shouldn't be the case that you end up in that situation. Then there's the fail option, which is it's not really possible to get any degree with. And again, I think that's pretty rare, because a lot of universities ensure that that's not going to happen by having these check-ins at a sooner date. The typical way that you might not pass would be the revise and resubmit option, where it hasn't passed, you'll need to repeat the thesis, but it's not like they're saying that your thesis is not a PhD thesis. I do think it's rarer for the other options to occur. And I think a lot of the time supervisors know going into the Viva what the outcome will be, and most of the time, if it's not ready for that, you won't be allowed to submit your thesis, because you have an approval from your supervisors to submit your thesis. And if it's not ready, they should know. And I think I do think it's rare to fail, but you want to go in with your best foot forward, and you want to try and pass at the highest level and avoid having to add significant portions to your thesis. Ideally, it'll be very minor revisions, such as what I have going on at the moment. The kind of difference between the types of questions that you get asked in the Viva versus at a conference is mainly just the fact that they're a lot more detailed. So in a conference, let's say if you're being asked questions and you can answer it and you can just kind of move on to the next person, whereas the examiners, of course, in the Viva can go back over the answer and ask you to go into it in more detail. So it's usually a lot more detailed. And the presentation that you give is also, in a conference, a lot of the time that people haven't read your work, whereas in a Viva they definitely have, so the way that you present that work will be quite different. Finally, I just wanted to briefly touch on preparing for the Viva. I will have a separate video going through each of these steps in more detail, and same for the kind of questions to be asked. I have a couple of these topics that I think deserve their own video, but this is more of a high-level summary. How are we doing for time? Not great. So I would definitely say it's important to take time away from your thesis before going back to it, because even in the revision process, it's really hard to see the flaws or to see those limitations in the thesis, or even the typos, once you've been staring at it for months on end. So I would say try and take, if you've got 2 months to your Viva, try and take a month away from it before looking at it again. Then reread the thesis, make notes on different chapters, so I'll talk about that more in the subsequent video. Try and go through the possible questions you could be asked, so try and come up with some practice questions. Of course, you'll need to make your presentation, and I would recommend doing a practice Viva with your supervisors, or if not with them, with some colleagues who are also in this PhD phase, and try and have them, prep you for some questions that might come up. There can be a lot of nerves on the day, so I would definitely say, do whatever it is you need to do to channel that nervous energy. I would recommend some sort of workout in the morning. I found that quite helpful. And make sure you plan to have something afterwards, even if you're worried about failing. I think I was, even though I knew logically it was really unlikely, I didn't want to plan anything in case it didn't go well. And then that meant it was a little bit anticlimactic, and I still feel like I need to do some celebration for it. So make sure you're prepared to celebrate yourself afterwards, regardless of how it turns out, because it's a difficult process, and I think you still deserve to acknowledge that regardless of the outcome. That is it for this video about the PhD defense. I hope it was useful, and as I said, I do have a lot more videos planned on this, so stay tuned. Make sure you subscribe, hit that notification bell, and I will see you all in the next video.